Appreciate you coming on the show. I'm really excited to speak with you.
It's a pleasure to be on the show. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking a little bit before we kicked this thing off and talking a little bit about your background. So one of the things that's really interesting, and we can talk a little bit more about this, is the fact that you're legally blind.
Right.
Um, and although it's progressive, you've always had poor eyesight. And we were talking about your background in junior hockey,
Right.
and you're Canadian for those people who don't know. But you started to talk a little bit about the way you approached hockey, and I thought it was extremely fascinating. So I wanted to hit the record button, and I'd love for you to start that story again.
Yeah. So being visually impaired meant that I couldn't see where the puck was all the time, um, but I could see players. And so I actually focused more on the movement of players and the structure of the game than I did just puck watching. And I was a fairly good hockey player. I'm 6'3". I weighed 200 pounds. I hit like a freight train. I was one of the fastest guys on the team. And when I played college hockey, my coach said to me, he goes, "You're 6'3", you weigh 200 pounds. You're leading the league in scoring by a lot." I said, "How the hell do you always end up wide open in front of the net?" I said, "I just go to open space. Like it just seems so right." But there were patterns involved in the play that I was paying attention to that most others weren't.
It's
And
Yeah, that's fascinating. That
yeah,
reminds me of the cliched quote. The quote that's probably uttered way too many times, but with Wayne Gretzky, and they always talked about how the reason he was so good was he always skated to where the puck was going, not where it had been.
right. And you could tell where the puck was because of where everyone's attention was and what they were focused on. And they were so distracted, it was just easy to slip into open ice or to anticipate where people were going to be because of the pattern of play.
Where does that come
Uh,
from? Is that something that's just innate in just the way your mind works? Do you think that had something to do with your impaired sight, or is it something
yeah,
you learned and developed?
that's a really good question, Greg. I think it's a combination of those things. Because partly I do think about the world in terms of systems, and I study human behavior, and I've always had sort of some insight around that. But you do compensate, right? You learn, and I skated a lot when I was a kid, so I developed those skills. I developed all the skills, but my mindset was different, and it was about how I thought about playing away from the puck. And and a lot of times when I talk to my sons or I talk to other athletes, it's everyone focuses on that moment when they've got the puck, but you've only got the puck for a few seconds a game,
Yeah,
right? The rest of the game is still going on. And you need to be thinking about if you're on the right side of it, where the play is going, where the risks are, or how you can get open for a teammate. Um, where am I dangerous? And that thinking process was so much different than chasing.
that's right.
Trying to anticipate rather than chase.
That's right. So, all right, you have a really fascinating background. You are an expert in an area that um, you don't hear a lot about experts in, but when you really
Right.
just take a second and you think about it, you realize it's like foundational to almost everything we do on a daily basis, not just in business, but from a society perspective.
Yeah.
I'd love just to hear a little bit about the journey. I mean, going from, college hockey and, sort of that approach to really becoming one of the world renowned experts in trust.
Yeah. And the journey does help explain my understanding of the topic. Um, so I was born and raised in Fort St. John, small town in northern British Columbia, about 12,000 people there when I grew up, to 13,000, and harsh winter conditions, fairly isolated. You had to work together. You had to pull together. And you talk about the athlete's mindset. Part of that is about creating team,
Mm-hmm.
right? Pulling together in the same direction. Well, folks in that environment when I was growing up, if you could help people, you did. And the strong protected the weak. And there was a sense of community that often doesn't exist in larger centers. And that was part of what pushed me to have a greater sense of empathy, a greater calling to be helpful. Um, but then also, growing up there, uh, I was 17 playing junior hockey when I got attacked by a fan with a club. Um, and he pulled me halfway over the boards in Fort Nelson, shattered my helmet, just about killed me. And it was 1984 when we didn't
Like
really know a lot about.
like a billy club type of thing.
Yeah, yeah, a wooden club, like a
Wow,
fish
wild.
bonker or something. Um, and my teammates came to my rescue. They pulled me back out of the crowd. One of the other players grabbed me, and I have no helmet on, and I'm barely conscious. And he starts just beating the tar out of me. Um, and he's slamming my head into the ice, and he's kicking me with his skates on, and just a riot breaks out on the ice. There's a bench clearing brawl. Um, I think mine was the only fight we lost. Uh, you know, I'm playing with a group of guys who were a robust group of individuals,
Sure.
and some of them went into the crowd afterwards because people in the crowd are throwing beer bottles at me and stuff as they're carrying me off the ice. Um, it was a gong show. Um, but I knew when I was 17 and playing junior hockey that I was going to lose my sight, um, and that I had to be able to think for a living. And so that was my plan moving forward. And all of a sudden, for a long stretch, I couldn't think at all. I had the attention span of a fruit fly.
Yeah,
And because we didn't know much about concussions, the whole mindset was walk it off.
that's
You're
right.
fine. And so I went back to playing, had several more concussions. I played college hockey for the next 2 years. I probably had 6 or 8 concussions over the
Sure.
next 2 years. Um, and, you know, eventually what that did, that experience taught me what it was like to feel helpless
Hmm.
and to be lost. And so it developed in me a deep sense of empathy. And, I went to college in Grand Prairie, Alberta, small, sort of another small northern community, um, and failed all my classes.
Mm.
And I'd been on the honor roll before that. Um, and so I went to the University of Victoria. I transferred to the University of Victoria, and I slowly started to recover. And but I would find, people would just sit down next to me on the bus, and they'd say, "I'm having a really hard time." And I didn't know what it was that was causing people to just open up like that.
Hmm.
And I thought, if this is going to keep happening to me, maybe I should get paid for this. So I started studying psychology and working with troubled teens and families in crisis and working on crisis lines and developing these skills to become, the best clinical psychologist I could become.
Hmm.
And partway through that journey, I realized a lot of the people I was working with were just doing the best they could.
Yeah.
They were stuck. It had taken them years to get there. Even if I could see a path forward, they couldn't take it. And so I transitioned. I thought this will drive me insane. And so I went into public administration, did a master's degree in public admin. And I ended up working in native land claims in British Columbia, which is one of the last places on the planet that hasn't settled them. And they would ask me these deep philosophical questions like, what is self-government? Or what will it be like 50 years after claims are settled? And the last question they asked me was, how do we convince a group of people we've shafted for over 100 years they should trust us?
Right.
And I thought, man, that's a good question. And it gets to the heart of those sort of long-term disputes, right? Those that seem so resilient and so passionate. Um, you're living in the States, so Democrats and Republicans right now.
That's right.
Or things around climate change or race relations or relationships between the police and the communities they serve. Um, all of those things are provoking these emotional disputes that are really difficult for us to resolve. And so I decided that was going to be my thesis. And I went to Duke and wrote my PhD on building trust in hostile environments.
Hmm.
And I ended up with, two of the world's leading academic experts on the topic on my committee, Sim Sitkin and Karen Cook, two amazing people. Um, and they sat me down after I finished and they said, when you first came to it, we had a conversation with each other and we said, it's too big, too complex. He never solves it.
Hmm.
We'll give him 6 months. He'll come crawling back to us. we'll let him chisel off a little piece of this and that'll be his thesis. And they said, 6 months in, you were so far beyond us, we couldn't help anymore.
Yeah.
All we could do is sit and watch. And they said, and here we are after 2 years, we think you've solved it. And so part of it was those insights I gained through the journey I took through my life and an understanding, so I developed this practical applied experience and this deep theoretical knowledge. And I had just awareness and insights that other people hadn't been forced to gather.
Yeah. Interesting. Uh, it's one of the things I was reading while just doing a little research on you is I think someone you were described as a savant, a trust savant, and
Right.
and I think the quote was something to the extent of ability to see trust problems and create a path forward for individuals and teams, right? And I'm just thinking about this like spatial, this ability to kind of think in 3D and spatial awareness that you had in hockey and it seems like you've been able to bring to this profession. Have you ever thought about the connection between those two?
No, you know what? You're the first one to talk to me
Yeah.
about that connection. And the fact is that I was a bit of an oddball when I was an academic because I was multidisciplinary, right? And the way it was described by some is you take a complex approach to complex problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so psychology gives us one lens, economics gives us another lens, political science gives us another lens. There's all these different lenses that people are using to look at the problem, and it's like the blind man describing an elephant, right?
Yeah.
They each have a perspective. But if you're able to pull back a little bit and say, I'm not married to any of those, I actually think of this as a system with different pieces at play, then you're free to develop different insights.
Yeah. So let's talk about that system. I mean, one of the things that resonated with me just because of my own personal experiences was, sort of the thought of going into a situation that, maybe isn't absolutely hostile, but the
Right.
ability to be able to gain trust in a relatively short amount of time is like absolutely crucial for the success of your objective. And with me, I've done a lot of consulting in the startup space where
Right.
I've had an investment group, a VC firm, or whatever it is that had a large stake in a company where a board has made a decision that they either want to supplement or they want to change leadership from the operational
Right.
level and kind of get parachuted in. And all of a sudden, I'm in a room with this group of employees and people looking at me wide eyed and they don't know what's going on and they're scared. Are they going to lose their job? And
Yeah.
all these different types of things. And it's, the first couple of times, I had to go through that experience. I think I came in with sort of a very strong point of view on, hey, here's who I am, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're doing wrong. And, it wasn't always successful. And then I think over time I've kind of developed and I realized that it was much more important to as I think you talk about a lot, is empathize with the group and make them feel like
Right.
part of the process that we're going to take together. But I'd love to hear just a little bit like, how do you approach a situation like that? What are some of those key, areas that you need to really be aware of as you're going into
Yeah.
hostile environments?
Yeah. And so as an example, I was asked to help, I was working with a company and they'd had me training some of their senior leadership folks. And they said, we'd love to have you spend an afternoon or a day with the board, the executive board.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, sure, not a problem. And then the day before they said, oh, by the way, the unions are going to be there, the two unions. And I said, well, that'll be a different dynamic. They said, yeah, we should probably let you know that we've been in court with each other for the last 5 years and everybody hates everybody.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times when you go into those settings, I think that trust is the willingness to be vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave. And in the situation that you describe, those people are vulnerable to you.
Mm-hmm.
And they're vulnerable to the decisions that you're going to make. But they have choices about how much more vulnerable they become,
Hmm.
about how much they share, about how much effort they put into achieving your vision. Because the more senior we become, the less direct control we have over outcomes, the more dependent we are on those we lead. And I think that trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability.
Hmm.
And so when we're deciding to trust someone, we ask ourselves two fundamental questions. The first is, how likely am I to be harmed, which is perceived uncertainty. And the second is, if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt, which is perceived vulnerability. And those multiply together to give us a level of perceived risk. And if we exceed our threshold of risk that we're comfortable with, we each have a different threshold. But if we exceed our personal threshold, we don't trust. Beneath it, then we do. And if we think about, what that means that if uncertainty is high, then vulnerability's got to be low for us to still fit below that threshold. But as uncertainty starts to decrease, the range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to expand. Right? And let's think about what people's vulnerabilities are at work. It's where they get their paycheck. But it's also where their friends are. It's where their sense of self and identity are. It's where their aspirations for the future are. And it's connected to the well-being of their family and their kids. All of those things are sort of tied into it. And so it's a fairly significant bundle of vulnerability we're experiencing. And then you walk through the door and there's already uncertainty, and now it goes up.
Yeah.
And they become remarkably uncomfortable.
So,
Right? And go ahead, Greg.
so in that situation, then it seems like the counteract is to try to eliminate the uncertainty as much as possible.
Yeah, try to reduce it as much as possible. And building trust is actually fairly simple from that perspective, right? Is where does uncertainty come from? How do I take steps to reduce it?
Yeah.
Where's the vulnerability coming from? How do I take steps to help people manage it? Because vulnerability it's not objective. It's subjective. It's my perception of what's at stake.
That's right.
And my perceptions can be part reality and part massive inflation. Right? So you've talked with a lot of athletes as they're transitioning out of the sport. Their perceived vulnerability is, not only do I lose that job, but I lose the fans, I lose the camaraderie of the teammates, I lose my sense of self, all of those things. And maybe my wife doesn't love me anymore, or my spouse doesn't love me anymore. Maybe my kids don't have any respect for me. They have these inflated notions of what the possibilities are, these irrational sort of fears that come with them. And so a lot of times what we need to do is systematically think about, where's the uncertainty coming from? And how do I take steps to manage that? And how are these people feeling vulnerable? Because what often happens when we see a lot of transition, you talk to entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
Those are organizations that are in constant flux. They're transitioning almost consistently and constantly. And so the uncertainty is high. And in settings where it starts to spike even higher because of things outside our control, people start looking for ways to be less vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
We hear conversations about quiet quitting, people being disengaged, and funders or other key stakeholders starting to get nervous, starting to impose their will on you. These are all things where people try to find either a way to reduce their uncertainty or reduce their vulnerability.
So
And
I mean, there's a lot here, and
yeah,
I I know you, along with being an author, speaker, you also do a lot of coaching. You work with a lot of different companies, CEOs. Actually,
yeah,
fascinating. You've done work with the Canadian military, right? I mean, you talk about trying to build
yeah,
trust up, with the military in Afghanistan, right? Trying to rebuild trust up with
with the locals.
the locals there, which
Yeah,
is somewhat similar to the Native Americans and some of the issues that they've had as well. Uh,
yeah,
when you go into these situations, and obviously I think going into a corporate setting is going to be significantly different than going into an area like Afghanistan, who's been dealing with war and different governments, political issues.
right.
Stakes are higher, the vulnerability is higher. But when you are going in and you're talking to a CEO of a company that brings you in, what are the types of problems? Like quiet quitting is a great example of that. I mean, I think there's a huge it's almost like a I don't know if it's a generational thing or a cultural thing or whatever it is, but I think the way people that now are in their 20s and maybe early 30s think about work, think about the profession is very different than it might have been when we were in our 20s and 30s. And
Right.
being a leader today is it's difficult because I think we as people now are in positions to be in leadership roles grew up in a certain type of work culture, and then you
Yeah.
naturally evolve. So you think that's the work culture, the way things should be. But as younger generations come up, they don't see things necessarily the way you may have saw them. So there becomes to be this little bit of a divide. And I'm just at that age now where I'm starting to kind of work with some young people and being like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, this is different. I got to evolve here to be able to connect with these people. It's not like it used to be. So I'm
Right.
curious, like, what are the types of issues you're seeing out there in the space, and how are you working with these leaders?
Yeah. So it's that's a great question. It's also a big question.
Yeah,
Um, because there's a lot going on, right?
yeah,
And part of the challenge that leaders are facing right now is what made a great leader 10 years ago doesn't now.
hmm
The definition for excellence is a moving target. And we need to be able to evolve and transition faster than we've ever had to before. And part of the challenge we're seeing, trust levels are the lowest they've ever been, um, in government and in institutions and in leadership and all those places. Well, let's go back to the model, right? Uncertainty times vulnerability equals risk. Vulnerability hasn't gone down, but boy, has uncertainty spiked.
hmm
We're seeing uh, virtual teams, we're seeing changes in values and norms, we're seeing changes in expectations from what a career means or what a workplace situation should look like. We're seeing changes, just the pandemic. We saw so many different to have different approaches. It varied by organization, by region, by state, by country. So the rules were so different in so many places. And in the face of that, uncertainty just keeps spiking, which means we can't tolerate as much vulnerability as we used to. And so we need to be more intentional than we've ever been about building stronger relationships. Um, trust has always had value, and as you were saying, it's foundational, right? It's a social lubricant. It allows societies to function, and it's why the Canadian military asked me to come and help them in Afghanistan, because it said there's no economic development going on.
hmm
We've been there for years. They still can't get power reliably into the and running water is hit and miss. And so we see pretty clearly that organizations thrive with higher trust levels. They have higher returns to shareholders, higher employee engagement, lower turnover, higher referrals. They just do better. And so it traditionally has had value, but now how valuable is it now that it's become so scarce? And so a lot of these organizations are struggling with attracting and retaining top people.
hmm
Their leaders are struggling with, and this is a really big challenge I'm seeing, stepping away from the things that they were good at and into the new responsibilities and expectations as things evolve and change. And part of that struggle is I become more vulnerable when I'm trying something new because I'm gonna mess it up,
hmm
right? There's gonna be a learning curve for me. I'm gonna make mistakes. And a lot of leaders struggle with that. They struggle with being vulnerable. And what they don't realize is that sends a message to everyone else. It's not okay to make mistakes.
yeah,
And in a world that's evolving as fast as ours is, and when we're talking about being agile and innovative and all those kinds of things, people are going to make mistakes. That's how we learn. It's how
hmm
innovation happens. Um, Creating an environment for that where people are appreciated and are expected. We evaluate them more on process than outcome, where we're thinking more about do the right things, have the right hygiene, and the right results will follow. That's a mindset that we need to start evolving towards.
yeah. I talk a lot about that. The term I use, kind of in alignment with the athlete entrepreneur mindset, is coachability, right?
Right,
It's the ability to be open and vulnerable and take feedback and not be afraid of criticism and those types
right,
of things. And when you're a leader, it's very easy to give it and to try to coach others, and they take it the way they want to do it. But a lot of the characteristics that make up a leader, or at least an entrepreneur, don't always lend themselves to being real open to hear feedback and criticism from other people. And
Right.
it's that absolute importance of being willingness to to make yourself vulnerable, and to take in input and feedback from other people that's going to help you develop. The question I have is, as you think about going into an organization, and we think about the equation of the vulnerability, and the ability to kind of have taken out the risk factor, or at least an understanding of what's going to happen.
Right.
Is it important that involves in the leader himself or herself, or is it something that we need to think about in the employee base? Is it something where, as far as the leadership team, the CEO, they need to think about, okay, there's only so much we can do to reduce the vulnerability of, economic uncertainty and somebody losing their job, and this is their
Right.
income, and what do they do from now? But what I can do is I can communicate better, right? And I can
Right.
be more clear, and have people have a clear expectation of what's going on. Like, when you look at it, is it sort of top down? We're going to address situations with a leadership team, and helping them kind of fix some of their coachability issues there, or is it something where we're looking to, hey, here's the empathy you need to have with your employee base that you're trying to build trust with, and here's how
Right.
you can be more empathetic and help get them in a position so that trust becomes built.
So for me, the one of the really important factors is having shared vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
And it means that everyone needs to be on the same page when they're talking about what trust is and how it works. I did some great work with one of the best leaders I've ever seen is a woman named Kelsey Trigg. She works at SAP, which is a huge global software organization,
Know them
over
well.
100,000 employees. Yeah. And she's their global head of HR advisors. She's the executive VP of global advisors. And so she serves 5,000 or 8,000 leaders within SAP. And I did some work with her and her team. They have a challenging environment because it's virtual and
Mm-hmm.
it's global. And so there's so many different traits and characteristics, and you know ethnicities and cultures, and
It's a German
so
company.
it's a
Very.
German company and it's a tech company,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they don't always hire for people skills. And so now you're trying to advise these folks and help them solve their people problems. And her team gets ridiculous evaluations, just off the charts. They're performing incredibly well, and she attributes at least part of that to the work I did with them, showing them the trust model, talking them through it, and then having a shared vocabulary about how to actually talk about trust
Mm.
in a way that doesn't provoke defensiveness. And this gap we find for leaders is the gap between how much they believe they're trusted and how much they actually are.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times leaders, I'll start talking to them about this and they'll say, yeah, my team really needs this. And, it takes a bit of time. And eventually we kind of get to the place where they go, oh, yeah, actually, I needed this.
Yeah.
Um, I was one of my best moments was working with a senior group of executives. We're sitting in the room together. And we're talking about, I talk about levers that we can pull to build trust. It's a systematic, very structured, very practical applied approach. But one of the levers we can pull is benevolence.
Hmm.
It's that belief that you've got someone else's best interest at heart.
Right.
And I'm asking them to explain or to tell me moments when they've been benevolent to somebody else.
Yeah.
And they're going around the room and they're talking about these moments where they've had a positive impact on somebody else's life. And the feeling in the room is just buzzing, right? Everyone's got smiles on their faces, everyone's happy, we're all feeling good. I said, this is fantastic. Now, if you guys could just explain to me why you're so effing selfish. And they go, well, what do you mean? I said, you've just told me how powerful it is to have that experience where you're able to help someone.
Mm-hmm.
And you never give anyone that opportunity to help you.
Yeah.
You never let anyone else have that moment with you because you never allow yourself to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And it was just a real aha moment. And it was a transition point for that team. And we see this struggle with this.
Where do you fall? Because I've been in this situation before, and it's a really really difficult position to be in, right? Let's go as high as the CEO of a company. You
Sure.
work for a board of directors. Board of
Yes.
directors essentially works for the stockholders or the shareholders of the company.
Yeah.
I remember in business school, it's all about you have a fiduciary, responsibility to your shareholders. Like that is your job as the CEO is to report up. So
Right.
the best interest, at least from a business school, and I don't agree with this necessarily myself, but the best interest should be in you're putting the shareholders' best interest at the top of your priority list. And the
Okay.
shareholders' best interest is absolutely to have a engaged employee base that is going to do the right things and be productive and be innovative and have great customer support and service, blah, 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 100%. But at the same time, if the best interest of the shareholders becomes laying off 12,000 people like Google just did, that's
Right.
not necessarily aligned with the employee base. So, I guess the question I'm asking is there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance that exists
Sure.
in the corporate structure. And as a question like that would come up from a CEO of a company that says, hey, listen, I get all of that, Darryl. I understand it. But my board wants results. My board wants this. My board wants that. My employees don't want to hear that because that's
Right.
going to scare them and it does make them more vulnerable. Like, how do you work with that? Like, how do you kind of get, some type of equilibrium there?
Right. And so part of the challenge that we face is that there's a time difference in terms of a lot of shareholders would like to have dramatic and positive results right now. And what they don't think about is the impact of that on the organization longer term. And so in part, you know, I talk about these levers. One of the one of the levers we like to pull is the ability lever. What does good look like? What is excellence? And we so seldom have that conversation within
Mm-hmm.
organizations. And it's our favorite lever to pull, right? I've got these kinds of credentials, this much experience, this sort of background. Um, but rarely do we actually come to an agreement about what does good look like? What would excellence look like from the perspective of the shareholders? What would the excellence look like from the perspective of the board? What would excellence look like from the CEO or other CEOs, from their peer group? What does excellence look like from those they lead? And we should actually be canvassing all of those different stakeholders to see where the overlaps are.
Mm-hmm.
And we should be able to say because, you know, there are levers there are levers within vulnerability that we can pull, but there's also these perceived outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there are four levers within uncertainty. And they are, uncertainty comes from us as individuals and it comes from the context we're embedded in. You've just described the context of the CEO, right? And there are formal and informal mechanisms of social control that constrain the CEO's behavior. And some of those are the board, some of those are the shareholders, some of those are, public opinion and the media, some of those are written into their contracts. And so there's all these different things that constrain them. So we can pull levers within us as individuals or within the context. We can pull levers within, right? We can talk about long-term versus short-term vulnerability. We can talk about where that vulnerability comes from. But then after we've made the trust decision, there's a perceived outcome. And there's a couple levers we can pull there. And if we actually agree on what a good outcome looks like before we start, then that means that we can have a shared understanding of what we should be driving towards.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you were coaching a sporting team and you thought a good outcome looked like everyone just had fun, and then the team lost a lot and parents started bitching and complaining because they wanted their sons to be superstars or their daughters to be superstars and go pro, well, you thought it was a good outcome, they didn't.
That's right.
Right. And so, my son plays baseball for a small university in Missouri, Hannibal LaGrange University. He got a baseball scholarship. And when he was 15 or 16, he said to me, "You know what, Dad, I think our team's going to be pretty bad this year." And I said, "All right." He said, "We got a lot of young guys. We're not very experienced. I think we're going to get our brains beat in. And I said, you need to redefine what success is. What are some of the things that you have control over that would lead to you having a good season? And he said, well, if I got better as a baseball player. I said, okay, so that's one, skill building. He said, if I was a good teammate, right? If I,
Mm-hmm.
help these younger guys learn and grow and develop, um, got the respect of the coaches, because I want to get a baseball scholarship. That means I'm going to need people to advocate for me. I need my coaches to be on side. And if I had decent personal results, you know, and so I said, okay, so you've now defined what success is within the parameters of your. And partway through the season, he came back to me and he said, "We're just getting our brains beat in, like we're 2-17 or something, right?" And I said, "Yeah, but how are you doing against the dimensions that you control?"
Mm.
And he said, "Well, my coach loves me, my teammates love me. I got nominated to the All-Star team. I'm doing well." I said, "So that's what you have control over."
Right.
And so in part, if we have a shared conversation with the shareholders and we set the expectations properly, and we say we're going to develop a company that's solid and a good performer long term, and that means if we have to fire 12,000 people, there's going to be a really good reason why we do that. It's not going to be to spike the shares so that CEOs and senior executives can maximize their stock options.
Yeah.
Um, it's going to be because this is best for the long-term health of the organization. And if we have to make investments that drive the stock price down a bit, we're going to do that. But the piece you have to be mindful of is people interpret the world through stories. If we're not collaboratively creating that story, then there's going to be 50 different stories out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to be able to link back. Remember, we said this is what good looks like? This is why we're doing this.
Yeah. So much of this really comes down to communication, right? I mean, it's alignment and communication. It's
Yeah.
you got to set the goals, you got to be consistent with it. You got to have some set of like long-term north star that everybody's shooting for, and it can't be shifting around every month or 2 months because that creates a ton of uncertainty. But once
Right.
that's set, it's really about just communicating to everybody so we're all aligned and we all understand what we're all there to do, right?
That's a really big part of it. And part of the challenge here is, let's go back to those sort of levers around uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Benevolence is this belief that you've got my best interest at heart. And when I work with families, I'll have a group of parents in front of me. I'll say, who here has their kid's best interest at heart? And of course, all the hands go up, right? And then when I say, how many of your kids would say that? I get about a third, right? And it's somewhat hesitant. And so if it's not obvious there, Greg, how is it supposed to be obvious for a CEO?
That's
How is it
right.
supposed to be obvious for someone who's just a frontline leader? Um, if we don't include the other person in the conversation, we miss. And a lot of times leaders will say, well, I do all the things you're talking about. I pull the levers. And I'll say, says who? Right? Because it doesn't matter if I think I'm benevolent. It matters if you think I'm benevolent.
That's right.
And that doesn't mean always being nice. And so what I'll talk to people about is I'll say, how do we pull that lever so it lands? So that we're transparent about it. And it's not just me communicating to you, it's us communicating together.
That's right. That's right.
And so a lot of times, go ahead, Greg.
Do you implement a lot of like 360 feedback type of tools for that exact reason? Because
I,
it is important to get the voice of the employee to help the leader understand actually what the perception is.
I do some of that. Um, More what I do is give people the tools and the framework to have a conversation with each other.
Mm,
Um, I had a leader was working with an organization. She's a great leader, but she was fairly new, and the organization measured trust levels, and the scale went from minus 100 to 100, and she was at 13.
mhm.
And they asked me to talk to her, and I okay, so let's talk about what trust is and how it works, and here's the 10 levers, and here's how you pull them. And then I talked to her team. We sat down and I said, here's the 10 levers. What would it look like if she was to show you benevolence? What does benevolence look like? What are your best interests? What does success look like for you? How does she do that? And now all of a sudden they've got a framework for a conversation. And I said, what does integrity look like? And integrity is following through on your promises and actions that align with the values that you express.
Mm-hmm.
So has she made promises that don't line up? Or has she not followed through on things? Has the organization not followed through on things? And then I said, what is excellence? What's a good leader look like? You've had leaders in the past that were good, those that weren't. What are some of the traits? And I gave them a shared vocabulary. 3 months later, they did another survey, and her score went from 13 to 80.
Mm.
And she's been at 100 since. And so there's this intentionality of conversation, of including you. And we need to be more intentional than we've ever been
Yeah.
because of the external uncertainty.
The shared vocabulary is something that's so important. And it's really hard to. There's a book I always quote. It was Made to Stick, and there's this entire passage around sort of the curse of knowledge, and essentially
Right.
it's something to the extent of it's very difficult to remember what it's like not to know something. So when we say something, we have all this contextual understanding in our own mind what a particular phrase or term means, and
Right.
say it with the thought that the person that's listening to you has that same context on what that word or that phrase means, and in most cases
Right.
don't. So you get these massive miscommunications because somebody's explaining something that they think should be taken perfectly clear, but the other side understands it differently and the context isn't there. So I love that concept of having that shared vocabulary where you can all
Right.
come together and agree on terminology, the context of that terminology, what it means, how it applies. And then as you're having these conversations, it's so much more easy to make sure that there isn't a disconnect at the end of that is the two
Right.
separate, right?
Absolutely. And I was hoping that you were going to say the book that you always cite is Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World by Darryl Stickel, but we're not there yet.
We'll get there. We'll
Uh,
get there. We'll get
we'll
there.
get there. But yeah, absolutely. And it's the curse of a lot of university profs, right? Who, I struggle with some of the university training and some of the workshops that people do because it's fire and forget. I'm going to download knowledge to you, and I'm going to expect you to have the same grasp of it that I have, having spent 20 years studying it. And that was a real journey for me, right? I went from having sort of the skills to build good relationships with people to deeper understanding of how that worked, to a deeper understanding of how people in general make decisions about trust. And then the other side of that, I had to be able to communicate that in a way that people could get it, and so I tried to make it as simple as possible. A lot of people, real people, will read my work or hear me speak and they'll say, this is obvious. It's
Yeah.
common sense, right? Trust academics who read my work go, oh my God, you are decades ahead of us.
Yeah.
And it's because I include things like context, like vulnerability, like emotions, like perceived outcomes that aren't really talked about much in the popular press around trust. And it's why we have these long-term disputes. Emotions sit in the middle of all this. If we like someone, we tend to have a more positive story about them. We look for reasons to trust them. We're more likely to trust them. It creates this positive, virtuous cycle. And the opposite happens if we don't like someone. But imagine we're coming at this problem, this incredibly complex emotional problem, from a strictly rational perspective. We don't get a lot of traction. And so we need to find ways to reset those emotional states. And to have a shared vocabulary is a way we can talk about things without saying, hey, do you trust me? Because that's a terrible question,
Yeah.
right? The right answer is with what? Because it varies. I trust you with some things and not with others.
So
And
I want to get into the book. There's
yeah,
one question in particular. Before we do, it's kind of been sticking in the back of my mind. I wanted to ask you this. I was talking to my personal story. I was talking to my 12-year-old daughter the other day,
okay,
and she had, without going into the details, without
yeah,
getting too personal.
Scarring her.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there was a thing that she potentially was bending the truth on to kind of get her
Right.
way, and I didn't want to absolutely call her out and call her a liar or anything like that. So and maybe there was a chance that it was truthful. I don't think it was.
Right.
I gave her this whole thing on like, hey, the thing about trust is, once you lose it, it's very difficult to get back. Kind of that idea, right?
Right.
Right now,
Yeah.
I trust you. Your parents both trust you. If you lose our trust by doing things that we find are not, then it's going to be very difficult down the road. And my question really is trust something that you can get back?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, uh, my because there's some people who have talked about maybe we shouldn't be talking about rebuilding trust. Maybe we should just be talking. Okay, so if trust was something that was lost forever every time we lost it, there wouldn't be any left,
Yeah,
right? And so, because through miscommunication or misunderstanding or a contextual thing where your daughter doesn't want to embarrass herself or her friends or is worried about the consequences or you losing it on her, of course you're going to trust her in the future,
yeah,
right? She's learning and growing and developing through that. And I got to tell you, stumbled into my area of passion, which is and the overlap between trust and family.
yeah.
Um, I have two sons. They're 21 and 18. They mean more to me than anything.
Hmm.
Dedication of my book is that they make me want to be a better person and make the world a better place. And I always use the trust model with them,
Yeah.
always. And when my oldest was 12, he turned to me one day and he said, "Dad, I know you're always about what's best for me. Even when you're with me, I know it's about what's best for me." And I thought, I'm winning, right? Um, and I've written an article. It's on my website, trustunlimited.com, about trust and parenting. I think it's incredibly important for us to build positive trust-based relationships with our kids, because when they become teenagers, do you want them going to their friends for advice on things that
Hmm.
might impact their lives forever, or do you want them coming to you? Who cares about your daughter more than you do, Greg?
That's right.
Nobody, right? You'd walk through fire for her.
That's right.
And you need her to understand that, and you need her to be able to come to you and say, "Dad, I think I messed up. Dad, I think I made a mistake." And so there's got to be a way for her to be able to recover from that. And partly it's us role modeling, right? I'm not a perfect parent, and I'm legally blind. I've got post-concussion syndrome. Like, I'm a flawed human being. And
Aren't
I
we
mean,
all?
if you want a complete list, Greg, you'd probably have to go to my ex-wife's blog. Um, it's heavy reading, but it's very detailed.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm not perfect, and I don't pretend to be, right? And so when I mess up, I go to my kids and I say, "I didn't handle it the way I thought I should have.
Yeah. So
I
so
made a mistake."
so building trust, exceptional leadership in an uncertain world. So 20 plus years of research and experience and
Yeah,
really your life's work in many ways, one of the leaders in the space, and it's in this book, right?
yeah, yeah. I really wanted to share it. Um, I'm trying to. I want to make the world a better place, no
Yeah.
less than that. And I see the complex, wicked problems that we were talking about before. They require collective collaborative action for us to solve.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of people talking about trust right now, but they're not talking about what to do about it. And that's what the
Yeah.
book does. That's what I do. And I
Because
had
this
I
is bigger than, I mean, we're talking about it in a little bit of a business entrepreneurial setting, but this is from a societal perspective, right? I mean, you're looking at this
absolutely,
much bigger. Yeah.
yeah. And I decided to focus on leadership first. If the book sells well enough, I'll do one on parenting
Yeah.
and family. But the model holds across all relationships, and I've seen it work all around the globe on an incredible range of situations. Um, I've developed a masterclass. I mean, I've had clients who came to me and said, business clients who came to me and said, "What I really want to talk about is my relationship with my son." And I did a 12-week program with a group, and what I do is I get people to practice the skills as they're going along. So I'll give them a template for a benevolence conversation and questions to ask, and they'll pick a trust buddy to practice with as they go along. And after 12 weeks, I'm asking this group of senior executives, how'd we do? Right? What's the feedback change been? And they're talking about, these profoundly positive impacts in their lives, these sort of situations that have occurred. The people are noticing that they're noticing a change in the way that their life is functioning. And the guy who wanted to focus on his son says, what I didn't tell you guys is that my wife had filed for divorce.
Mm.
Here we are 12 weeks later. We're closer than we've ever been. My 15-year-old just threw his arms around me, said, I need you in my life, Dad, and gave me the biggest hug I'd ever had. He said, that's how it's going.
Yeah.
And I don't want that impact to go away if I do.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
That's why I wrote the book.
that's awesome. And just as you've explained this to me, and how clearly you're able to break up the components from understanding the uncertainty side of it versus the vulnerability side, and how the two come together, and then understanding, what are the components that make up uncertainty, and kind of breaking it apart. It made me think a little bit of, I might be butchering who this quote's from, but I remember reading somewhere, I think it was Mark Twain, and he started off a letter something to the extent of, I apologize for how long this is. If I had more time, I would have made it shorter. And
Right.
the whole point is, it's incredibly difficult to take complex subjects and make them short and concise and easily understandable and digestible. And for you to take something as big as trust, which is really a very profound statement that is so broad, and be able to break it into these components, and be able to put a framework together that anybody from a set of parents thinking about how they want to raise their kids to a CEO of a Fortune 500 company can practically apply in their lives is pretty amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a life's journey. Um, and you're right. I've taken as much of the insight as I can and tried to make it so accessible to make a difference in the world. And it's a real compliment to me when people say this feels simple, it feels intuitive, it feels obvious. I've worked with tech people who say, you've given me a formula. I'm actually able to
Yeah,
talk to people now,
that's right.
right? And so that's the aspiration, is that everyone is able to, and the book, I've been told, is very readable. Like, it's not an academic treatise or anything. There's a lot of stories in there. And this is part of the way we teach, right? Is I I tell stories, I try to be compelling, but I also try to apply it to your life, right? And so um I would love to have you read the article I wrote on trust and parenting, and for us to have another conversation about your 12-year-old daughter.
Yeah, yeah, I would love to. I'll be honest with you, we got to wrap this up, but there's another 10, 12, 15 areas that I wanted to dive into that I just don't think we'll have time. I think there's a whole entire world, and just to maybe give a sneak peek of a follow up we could have is,
Yeah.
I'm so fascinated with the news cycles and social media, and now, and I don't know how closely you're following some of the areas with artificial intelligence and bots
Right.
and deep fakes, and I mean, it's just, as more and more information is being created, it can kind of be created by anybody. People don't have to
Yeah.
stand by who is actually the person doing it. I think it just raises that level of distrust in society, and I think what we've
Yeah.
seen in the last however many years, we've just seen how toxic having that lack of trust. I mean, news isn't even news anymore, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's like it's like you watch one news channel, you watch the other, they're talking about the same thing. You would think that they're completely different,
Yeah.
events that occurred. So, yeah, I don't
People seem to be really comfortable just lying,
just lying, right?
and
And
there's no consequence,
that's right.
right? Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
yeah, maybe we'll have to save that for the next conversation. But
I'd love that.
any takeaways, final takeaways that anybody out there listening right now can take, and obviously go pick up the book and read it. But what are some of the main things that you think that just anybody on a day in day out basis needs to like internalize and sort of take with them in life?
Right. So People ask me how to build trust quickly. I say make yourself a little bit vulnerable first and then show some benevolence.
Yeah.
Because being a little vulnerable makes us want to respond in kind. It's called reciprocity. And if you're a little bit vulnerable to someone and they don't respond, they don't make themselves a little bit vulnerable in return, that's a good signal that you probably shouldn't go any deeper.
Hmm.
So not diving off the deep end, but just starting to share a bit about yourself and sharing a bit of information, seeing where there's connections. It's a great way to build relationships and asking how you can be helpful.
That's right.
Um, what does success look like for you? How do I help you get there?
It's fantastic. Darryl, I appreciate it, man. It's a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
I've really enjoyed it as well, Greg, and I hope that there are many more in the future.